Let me first introduce Edie Abraham Macht, who's going to be our discussant. Edie is a senior ed studies scholar from Brooklyn, New York. She's majoring in American Studies and plans to be an American history teacher after graduation. And then joining Edie, we have Elissa Levy, who is a Yale College 2009 graduate who studied physics and worked in the hedge fund industry for 8 years as a researcher before joining the New York City Teaching Fellows in 2017. And so now she teaches physics and computer science in the New York City public schools at the High School for Climate Justice. She facilitates teacher workshops around the country, and she publishes articles online about equity and STEM education. Next up, we have Israel Tovar. Hi, Israel. Who's Yale College 2017, currently teaches world history and AP World History in Washington, D.C., and he's co-founder of the Dream Teacher Project and an Ed Studies alum. We also have Nana Massie, who is joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and she currently teaches in Pittsburgh. Prior to that, she taught in Seoul, South Korea, and Fukuoka. Am I saying that? Fukuoka, Japan. And she's taught social studies, K-12 ESL, and she's certified as an international baccalaureate teacher. And our last panelist is Constance Darshea Collins, Yale College 2011 graduate. It is super late in Uganda, so we are so glad that she's joining us in the middle of the night, her time. She's taught in the United States, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, and she's currently the Service Learning Coordinator at the International School of Uganda. So her interests in education include critical pedagogy, liberatory education, service rooted in love and dignity, and using her voice to dismantle oppressive systems that exist in education.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today leading this panel of teachers. They're all amazing people. And yeah, we're going to have a lot of time for questions. So I would encourage you to just ask anything you want to know because they have a huge diversity of experiences, as you'll see. So I thought first we could just have everybody just like reshare their name and pronouns and then tell kind of a brief story of how you got into teaching. Some of that might have been included in your bio, but basically just how you got into teaching and then how you got to where you are today. So maybe Alyssa, you could start with that.
Sure. I studied physics at Yale, graduated 2009. I thought maybe someday I would be a teacher, but not yet. I didn't know what I wanted. Students at Yale, you know who recruits, and I ended up in finance for 8 years. I actually had a great time. It was a really meaningful experience, loved my colleagues. Something was missing, and the part of me that wanted to be a teacher got bigger and louder. So in 2017, I left finance and went through the alternate certification program that is the New York City Teaching Fellows. So as I think Melissa mentioned, because it's specific to needs, they said, you have a background in physics, we need physics teachers, you're teaching physics. All right, great. Got my master's at Pace University. I've been teaching at the High School for Climate Justice in East Harlem. This is my 5th year now, just got tenure, and it's been amazing.
Thank you so much. Israel, do you want to go? And then you can popcorn to one of the other teachers when you're done.
Sure thing. Hey, everyone. My name is Israel Tovar, pronouns he, el. I currently teach high school world history and AP world history here in Washington, D.C. I graduated from Yale College back in 2017. I majored in ER&M and was also an Ed Studies scholar. So I taught English to Latine undocumented folks in Nashville when I was in high school. So when I got to Yale, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. But when I was there, this tacit pressure of pursuing more prestigious careers was definitely present. And so I thought that I was going to do education policy and education law. And so I interned on the Hill for a summer, right? TBT. And I interned at the New York State Education Department. And that was the summer after my junior year. And when I was there, I just realized that I just didn't want to be in education policy. I just wanted to be on the ground working with communities and families. And so I decided to apply to master's programs that will give me a master's in education and also teaching credential. That took me to the Bay Area, to Stanford, where I did the Stanford Teacher Education Program. I was teaching Mexican American history in San Jose and then going to campus in the evenings to take coursework there. And I fell in love with teaching. So I've been teaching ever since then. I then moved to Nashville, taught middle school, US history there for a year. And this is my third year teaching here in DC. So this is my fifth year teaching in total. And I absolutely love teaching. It's an incredibly challenging profession, but it's also an incredibly fulfilling profession. I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else.
Nana,
can I hear from, I think it's Constance. Can you go next, Constance?
Hey everyone, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful panel. My name is Constance Darshea Collins, she, her pronouns, and I graduated from Yale in 2011. I was an AFAM major with a concentration in women's gender and sexuality studies. After graduating, I actually went back to Atlanta, where I'm from, to get a kidney transplant. So during that first 6 months, I was just shadowing teachers in Atlanta, some of my former teachers, and I loved being in the classroom. And then I moved back to New Haven, and I worked for the Achievement First schools there. And I worked there for 3 years. But then I think Mira kind of touched on this a little bit, the no excuses policy just didn't really jive with me. I think that they may have changed, but I unfortunately was having a really, bad experience in my third year. And I left in the middle of the year, sadly. It was a very hard decision, especially being, there are young people who are impacted by these decisions, but it was something that I needed to do. So in the end of 2014, I moved to Switzerland, and I was working as an assistant teacher there and as a nanny, actually, before I went back to New York to go to Teachers College for my teacher training. After that, I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and taught there. I taught middle school social studies there. Then I moved to South Africa and I taught middle school social studies there as well. And I was the service learning coordinator for 2 years. And I got another kidney transplant during that time in South Africa. But I loved my time there. And actually in Congo, I met my now husband, and we're living in Uganda. And we're both teachers from the US who work in international ed. Now we're here in Uganda, and I'm the service learning coordinator, and I'm getting a second master's at Harvard Graduate School of Education in race, gender, and educational leadership. I want to stay connected to the classroom, but I'm also looking at consulting opportunities within international education for the DEI realm, just because I feel that there's a need, and there's also a gap for students of color in international ed. It's very white, especially as you move up in leadership, very white and very male. So that's my story in a nutshell.
I'm Nana Massie, she, her, and I was class of 2005, and I majored in history and international studies. So I was very much thinking about things like, working for the State Department or things like that. And my first year out of college, I actually had a consulting job, and I was in DC. My husband's college roommates had gone to a fair at Yale where they had ended up with an international school, and it was a world I didn't even know existed. And so as we were in Washington, and I was not feeling super meaningful in my work, and I really wasn't feeling like having a good time either. And that's something that I had always felt when I had a lot of background in tutoring, and volunteered with English tutoring at Yale. Was a program called Bridges. I don't know if it's still around, but we used to tutor adult English students. I just thought, you know what, I didn't know this was a thing, that I could go out and be a teacher, and without having committed those years of master's first to find out if I even really wanted it. So I did find a position through a job fair and ended up in South Korea for 2 years in Seoul, and was a secondary social studies teacher, which means also that you get all the weird things in the corners of your schedule. So in addition to that, I was also like the first grade art teacher for some reason, which was really a deep end experience. After that, I did try a year of a master's at the University of Edinburgh to see if I wanted to teach in an academia setting, teaching older and professional aspiring students. And I just, every time I researched anything like historical, I just wanted to make a lesson plan out of it. I didn't want to write about it and try to get published. And I thought, you know what? Masters and PhDs in history are ending up in high school a lot anyway. So I'm just going back to the classroom. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to run this risk. I love what I'm doing. And then I ended up for 3 years in Japan. I'm back in the United States now, largely because of being near family while I have small children. I have a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. So it's been a fascinating COVID ride over here. And while I've been here, I got a certification in ESL, which in Pennsylvania is a secondary certification. And it's not a main certification. You have a main teacher and then you add it on. And then I also have a certification in English. I got my Pennsylvania certification there is a private school certification in Pennsylvania, which may be useful to some people. If you are just looking to teach on a overseas certification, you need somebody to sign off on your paperwork. It's a less formal process, and you can have that. And then you can take almost any US certification overseas. So that's, I would say, look by state. And then I have a regular Master's of Arts in Teaching from the University of Pittsburgh, which gave me my certification to teach here, but I haven't actually needed it because I've stayed in private schools here. And currently I'm teaching at a school called Kentucky Avenue School, which has a high population of students with learning differences and special learning needs, and having a blast. So but someday I hope to go overseas again. So that's my story.
Thank you all so much. I can't believe the variety of countries and cities that we have. Like, I feel like it's at least 30 or something among everybody. It's very impressive. So yeah, I think it would be great if you could now kind of all share what you see as sort of like the benefits or like pros of your pathway that you took into teaching, whether that's alternative certification or traditional masters or international ed, and then what some of the drawbacks might be, and kind of connected to that, like, do you see certain people or like certain qualities as like making people, certain people like really excited about this pathway potentially, or maybe not such a good fit for them? So I guess whoever has an idea first can just go ahead and share, and then we can kind of popcorn around.
I don't mind starting. I'm always happy to if you want to go, Constance, go for it. But okay, I will share that I am a master's program skeptic. When I did my master's at Pitt, I had been teaching for 5 years at that point. I had more classroom experience than all but I think one of my professors. So that was a little dubious. I had one professor tell me that one of my lesson plans wasn't going to work in an ESL classroom. And all I could think was, okay, but I taught that 5 years in a row in ESL classrooms and it seemed to do okay. So I looked around the classroom with me. There were 35 people in the classroom, and I'll be the, blunt, 5 of them maybe belonged in a classroom. In a lot of cases, these master's programs are taking a lot of tuition and not in a way that's sustainably related to the job market, and not in a way that was selective for the students, whether or not. A lot of people going around the room was, why are you here? Well, I majored in history, so I guess I'm going to be a history teacher, as opposed to, I have a passion for teaching. I want to be here. I want to work with kids. I believe in what I can do in the classroom. So I think an advantage to going the way that I went was, I think some of these people come out of master's programs feeling a little bit pigeonholed and not necessarily belonging with the degree that they got. By going the way that I went, I have no questions that this is what I'm supposed to be doing, that this is what I love to be doing. And I'm not doing it because I can't figure out anything else to do with my $45,000 or $50,000 of debt. But the fact that I went to the master's program later, I'm the only person I know, I think I may have turned a profit on my master's program because I had a baby and my insurance was amazing when I was a graduate student. And They had given me some financial aid, and there was some sort of fellowship that I got like for working part-time with them. So like I did the math on it. I think I saved money by going to grad school, which is kind of unusual, but it would never have happened if I hadn't gone the other way. The other thing I wanted to share with you, I believe Professor Debs has told me that this is on the wiki, but I'm going to go ahead and paste it in the chat. This is my basics, like nothing document about, so you want to start in international schools. And Constance, you may take a look at that and think there's some things that are missing. But I've tried to kind of say, what are the questions you should be asking yourself? What are the questions you should be asking the schools? What is some of the differences among regions? And Constance definitely would have more experience in, for instance, Africa than I had, because I was only in East Asia. And I worked with people who had primarily been in East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. So there are questions to ask about things like salary and benefits and that kind of thing. So that may be of use to some of you, and that lives on the wiki. So I hope that's kind of on topic. So I would say, bottom line is, the master's route may not educate you professionally the way that you hope it will. For me, a larger part of it was random, based on the mentor teacher that I ended up partnering with. I ended up with someone who was a really helpful, great partner, but many people did not. And going classroom first is absolutely being thrown in the deep end. But I don't think I would have not been in the deep end if I'd come out of a master's, because I don't think it prepared me much more, except I did have some good coursework that improved my DE&I at pedagogy. So there you go.
I can jump in here. Constance, do you want to go? I know you were going to go previously.
No, it's kind of about the
Go
master,
ahead.
so let's.
Okay, all right. So I did a master's in education, right? So I did a teacher education program pathway, and I'm going to be completely honest. I think that it did not prepare me for the classroom, just because most of the graduates from STEP tend to teach at more like middle class, upper middle class schools in the Bay Area. And so I feel like, although I was more prepared to enter the classroom than, someone who did TFA, I still felt very unprepared to teach in an urban context with low-income Black and Brown students. I currently work with 5 first-year teachers, and I have 2 who are in TFA, 2 who did credential programs, and 1 who works in a private school, and they're all like struggling, because it's just like first-year teaching is very, very challenging. And so the reason I decided to do a master's program was because I had the funding from the Gates Millennium Scholarship. And so I had that opportunity to not pay for my master's. But if I didn't have that opportunity as a first-gen student, I don't think I would have pursued the master's route. The teachers that I'm working with, like I will say that the students who did their master's program are a little bit more prepared for the classroom, not significantly more, but they also are not as busy as folks who are in TFA. So folks who are doing TFA, they are first-year teachers and taking grad school classes and doing X, Y, and Z. And so they are more stressed out because of the additional responsibilities, and also because they didn't have a choice in the school that they are teaching, right? And so that's the other opportunity about doing masters. You have more leverage when you're applying to schools, right? And so even though the first-year teachers that I'm working with are still not prepared for the classrooms that they're in, there's differences in the levels of stress from the teachers.
I guess I'll echo similar sentiments. I think that one challenge that master's programs in education face is aligning themselves vertically as the landscape is constantly shifting. And so what is important is different today than it was 5 years ago. So how do you create a 2-year course progression that's going to stay over time, and you've got professors teaching things and it builds? Oh, and also it's going to be different tomorrow. So I will say that my master's courses were good. Like, the things I learned were very important. The readings, the philosophy, ways of being in the classroom, but it also ended up being quite repetitive and redundant. Like, I felt like I took the same class many times. And I think it's a consequence of the field, and it's hard, right? It's different from, say, physics, which is, my other background. Is very clear, like in this physics class, you do this part, and in this physics class, you do this part. In education, everything's interconnected. And as others have said as well, once you're in the classroom, like that's where the real experience happens. And I love the trial by fire. That's a big part of why I left finance. I didn't like sitting in professional meeting rooms with PowerPoints that we'd spent 100 hours on for a 30-minute meeting. Like I wanted constant chaos and noise and energy. And I found it, right? And I love it. And so it was great doing masters at night and teaching during the day. And, I will say that almost all Yale students are already looking for other things, and they're part of extracurriculars. And the same goes for teaching, right? The master's program is not the end of learning. And I've really found my home in other professional teaching organizations, STEM Teachers NYC, Academy for Teachers, the Underrepresentation Curriculum, which is a group I am now a part of, and like all of the really deep DEI work and how do I support my students of color, like that's been outside of my graduate program where I found the communities that do that. So I think it's a web. And I think graduate programs are one part of your support system as an educator.
Constance, did you want to add anything? I know you had talked about like really appreciating that you were able to move around a lot, like as part of your pathway. So I was wondering if you had anything to add on that note.
Yeah, so I echo what everyone was saying about the master's programs. I really did enjoy my time at Teachers College. It was great. I did have a few years of experience before I joined the program, which helped. I think if I had gone right after college, like I would have been a mess, a hot mess. But I think if you can get a fully funded program, that would probably be the best bet. Just because, really where you get that experience is being in the classroom. Like you can sit in the classroom all day and talk about theory, but once you're in the classroom, like you really, that's where you find yourself as a teacher. So I think, master's programs in education can be very pricey. So if you can get a fully funded one, that's probably the way to go. Make sure you do your research for sure, not just any program. But yeah, the prices are crazy. But in terms of my pathway, I'm super grateful for what education has allowed me to do, like where it has allowed me to go literally in my life, literally and figuratively, to different countries, and the learning experiences that I've had from these from just moving around to different countries, and I started studying abroad in France, like 2 summers at Yale, and I was like, I love this. How can I make this my life? And being able to go to Switzerland and different countries on the continent has been great. I do have gratitude for my experience in the charter school network, because it showed me, I'm not gonna put down, so it just showed me what, what I didn't want. It showed me some things that I did want in my classroom, but the behavioral, I hope it's changed, but the behavioral aspect of it was really tough for me. I did start off as a teacher resident at the school, and it was this program is great. This is a great school. Look at what we're doing, where we're sending kids to schools, et cetera. But at the heart, I think you really have to do your research and see whether or not what's actually happening in the classrooms align with your personal philosophy to education. And at that point, I didn't really have that. We didn't have education studies at Yale. I think there was like a small, like a few classes on education, but I wasn't able to really find my teaching philosophy before I
Sorry, I got crashed. This is Brownie. He says hi.
Constance, I think you might have frozen. But maybe when you reconnect, we can come back to you. Professor Debs, how many questions do you think we have? Oh, you're back. Yeah. Would you mind sharing? We missed you for a minute. Would you mind just sharing like the last maybe 30 seconds of what you were saying?
Oh yeah, I was just saying like finding your educational philosophy is really important before you enter into any educational space. I did not have that before. I just jumped in, and I found it as I went, which was great. But making sure you do your research into whether or not it meshes. That's all.
Thank you so much. So yeah, Professor Debs, do you think I should do one more question or two more questions, or what do you think we have time for?
Let's say one more question, but also if people want to start asking questions in the chat too, then we can go from there.
Perfect. Yeah, I think this question will be a good segue into more individualized questions. Because yeah, I think it would be great to close on just kind of what general pieces of advice you all have for people who are thinking of entering teaching. Maybe a few people could share like job search advice, and then a few could share just like the first year in teaching, like what should you know? Because I know that almost everyone has said that that's an extreme challenge. So anybody who has an idea can go ahead and unmute.
I would say, I mean, we talk a lot about knowing what you want, having an educational philosophy, deciding private school versus alternate certification versus international. And the reality is, I still don't know what I want, but I'm happy. And you'll find your way there, right? None of us could have predicted 10 years ago we'd be where we are today. So my biggest advice is expose yourself. And I am volunteering, like seriously, and I promise you my principal's fine with it. Come shadow me, right? It's a train ride from New Haven to New York. Get off at Harlem, like any day you want. I'm serious. It's a wonderful school. You're gonna love it. And likewise, for whoever else you connect with, just learn and expose yourself, and the rest kind of works itself out over time. That would be my advice.
I'm later and further in both my career and my life than these whippersnappers here. So I will add some of what Alyssa's talking about in terms of going places and where, as far as going, like living internationally and things like that. You have a lot more freedom and time now than you realize if, for instance, Constance was saying that she's married to a fellow educator, right? When you have if you end up with a partner and you have two people whose jobs both need to be in a similar location, that's going to tell you all of a sudden your list of grad schools you can attend is going to be constrained by that. When you have kids, where you are going to be able to live in terms of cost of daycare, whether or not grandparents are going to need to be nearby to help you with things like that. So I would say, I remember when I was in college, people used to talk about how, like, as a freshman, you'd show up and you'd just kind of take your high school schedule. You'd be like, I'm going to take an English class and a math class, and that's your first semester freshman year. Don't get out of your 20s and don't get into your 20s into that time period and kind of think that you have to sort of settle into something that's familiar to you. This is your best chance to throw all your applications out there and see what master's program is financially sustainable for you. My husband and I went to the job fair that ended up with us in South Korea. He was a teacher at the time. Now he's education adjacent. He's in ed tech. We went to that job fair and we could have walked home on any of 6 continents. I'm not aware of any international schools in Antarctica, but you never know. And we just went there, rolled the dice, and we came back and said, well, look, apparently we're going to be living in South Korea next year. Like, we're getting married in July. We'll be in South Korea in August. It's going to be a wild summer. So I would say you have a flexibility now that you may not realize because it's normal to you. But that flexibility won't be around forever. So there's some value to capitalizing on that now and giving yourself some of these, taking some of these chances and taking some of these opportunities. And if they don't work out for you, you know, you can undo them more easily than if you've settled your kids in a school district or your spouse or your partner has taken a job in that same city. So that would be something I would throw out there.
I would add briefly to like tap into that Yale network. There's a lot of fabulous Yale alumni educators who, like as you're seeing tonight, who have a wealth of experience. Tap into that network and ask us for our mentorship, for our experience, so we can share our stories with you, and so you can get a better sense of the type of route that you want to take, right? So don't forget about that, and really important resource. And I would strongly encourage you to learn our stories and our experiences and see which ones you resonate, which pathway you want to take specifically, because each pathway is very different. And so educating yourself on that is really important.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Your network, someone put the Yale Alumni Educators, was it the Facebook group on there? I don't know if you all are even on Facebook anymore, I think, like, but if you are,
We're old, Constance, we're old.
But, you know, you have an incredible network of educators that are in the Yale network. And we're so happy to speak with other aspiring educators. I mean, all the educators that I know who I went to school with are like, yes, let's talk, let's chat. I even reached out. I was like, I want to talk to people. I want to share, you know, like international ed. A few things about international ed that I don't know if you all are aware of, but like the salaries are, you know, they're pretty decent, depending on where you go. They're quite decent. And you pay, like the school pays your taxes in the country where you live. So you go home with your full salary. They pay for your home. Like right now, I'm living in a 5-bedroom, 5-bathroom home in Uganda with a view of Lake Victoria, and all the other places that I've lived in, like they pay for your home. If you do have children, I have lots of colleagues who have children. I mean, I know you all are not thinking about this right now, but
it sneaks up on you.
But they pay for your tuition. Like there were a few kids last year from my school, no, 2 years ago actually, who went to Yale actually. So I'm trying to look. Are you on here? But there are a lot of benefits, and in addition to having a community of international students in your classroom. From all over the world, similar to, you know, being at Yale, just like a myriad of cultures and experiences in the classroom. There are benefits to also being in the US and in different spaces. I only worked in the urban space and working with that population. I came from College Park, Georgia, so I was in the hood. Like I grew up in the hood, and there are benefits to both. But I'm here to promote international ed. If anyone's interested, there are so many benefits, and it's so incredibly beautiful to be in a classroom, in an educational space with people who have such varied cultural experiences. I cannot stress enough how eye-opening that is. It's really beautiful. So yeah, reach out if anyone's interested. I'll drop my email in the chat as well. But yeah, that's my plug.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Yeah, that's a perfect segue, because I was just going to invite any teachers who want to put their emails in the chat or any other relevant links or social media or anything where people can contact you. But yeah, hopefully this panel is an indication that you should reach out to these people and also other people in the Alumni Educators group. I'm in it. I've been in it since Professor Debs' class, which I took my freshman fall, just because I wanted to see like what the world was like out there with people who teach after Yale. So I definitely recommend joining that. So should I start taking questions? Yeah, so I see that there's a question in the chat from Leo. It's a question about the difference between embedded city and state residency programs and teacher pipeline programs? That might be a question for Professor Shivi or Professor Debs. I'm not sure. Just like a clarification.
What Alyssa says too, because she actually did New York City Teaching Fellows. I mean,
Okay.
the big thing, a lot of the pipeline programs end up, you know, there's more variability in terms of your placement, and you're not picking the city or state that you're necessarily being put into. And a lot of them are more aligned with more charters than the city and state residency models are aligned with public schools typically. Alyssa, I don't know if you have anything to add about New York City Teaching Fellows.
Yeah, so you have to know what you're applying to. Teach for America will put you anywhere in America, no choice. New York City Teaching Fellows, which I think has been rebranded New York City Teaching Collaborative, it has to be in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and you choose. You interview with principals for normal openings and get hired just like anyone else, but you're working on your degree in parallel. And so I chose the school I'm at, and I'm very happy there. And I think other cities like DC has a similar program, but it's going to be in a place where there's high need. And right, like there is a shortage in my certification area. So that has to be something you're committed to. I will tell you, I wasn't necessarily committed to it in the long run at the beginning. I was like, oh yeah, I'll work, you know, in South Bronx, whatever. And then like, I'll go teach at, you know, a magnet school or something. And no, like not at all. I love it. And my kids are so brilliant and they just don't know it. And oh my gosh, how important it is to help them realize how brilliant they are when the system's been telling them they're dumb for so long. But I wouldn't have known that had I not gone the path I went. So yeah, and it just read the fine print on the programs when you're applying to them.
Alyssa, I'm just curious, are there, so like if there are people who are placed with Teach for America in New York City, and then there are also people who go in via the New York City Teaching Fellows route, are there kind of substantive, so if you're both going in without experience, you're getting your master's at the same time, is there any other kind of way that the experiences are different for those 2 groups of students if they're teaching in the same set of schools?
It's pretty similar, although in my experience, Teach for America has been phasing out in the cities that have their own programs. So the Teach for America footprint in New York is tiny, if it even exists at this point. It really is Teaching Fellows. And I think even Teaching Fellows is fading out. And the Teaching Collaborative now has cohorts in the spring and the summer and the fall, which is why you just need to go to those websites. These things are changing all the time, honestly.
And a lot of the cities created their own programs in response to the success of TFA and basically as a competition to TFA. So that makes sense as well.
Okay, are there any other questions? If you have a question, you can either just raise your virtual hand or put it in the chat. Okay, Sam's asking, how difficult is it to get certified in other states if you want to move? Is it a huge headache or relatively doable?
I can answer that question. So it depends. If you want to teach in New York or California, those are the most challenging states to transfer your credentials. So I got credentialed in California, and so it was relatively easy to transfer my California credential to my Tennessee credential. I just had to take a couple exams there to get my social studies clearance. And then I moved again to DC, and I used my California teaching credential to get my DC credential, and that was super easy. But if I would have used my Tennessee to DC, it would have been different. And so make sure that you are looking at the different requirements for each state, because they can be very different. But I do want to put on your radar that if you do want to teach in a specific state, particularly New York or California, you should get credentialed there, because it can be way more challenging to get credentialed there. So that's something I kind of want to highlight.
And I'll add that generally correlated to the salaries and the strength of the union in the state. Pennsylvania is another state with if you don't graduate from a Pennsylvania teacher program, it's a giant pain in the butt to get your Pennsylvania teaching credential. And the salaries on the union, it's just significantly stronger here. Where teachers are in a shortage, and that would typically be Southern and Appalachian, you're more likely to find more alternative pathways and to find more flexibility in accepting out-of-state qualifications. If you're teaching internationally, and Constance, you can add to this but I have found that typically all US certifications are treated equivalently. All they're trying to do is tick the box on the visa, which says, yes, they have a certification. And so in that case, if that's your objective, I would say find the easiest state to get your credential in, because you don't need to be with a certain thing, but that can sneak up on you 8 years later when you're trying to move back to the US if you decide to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to the international piece. I echo what Nana was saying about the easiest place, but also in order to get if you want a very strong international school that doesn't have a high turnover rate, you would need to have experience first before going. Most of the international schools do require some like at least 3 years experience, but there are other, I'm not sure, Nana, what like in South Korea, if you had to have that.
Yeah, what I put in the document that was shared is I tried to categorize schools by what I would call more competitive, not that for teachers, not necessarily a higher quality school and not necessarily a better experience for a teacher, but just more teachers trying for each position. And the more competitive the school is, the pickier they are. And it also tends to be geographic by region. So typically schools in the Middle East and in China, and to some degree in South Korea, see higher teacher turnover and are often ready for, if you walk in there with a bachelor's degree in the field, you're legally qualified to teach in the schools. You just have to get a school to take you. I have been in new schools and a relatively high turnover school and had a blast. So like whether high turnover itself the issue, it may or may not be. It just depends on the environment. So what I would say is, if you're looking at Western Europe, if you're looking at what I would call sort of the flagship schools, like the main schools in the capitals, or schools in particularly desirable areas, that's the more qualifications you would need to have and the more competitive the position is. If you're willing to go for a classroom assistantship, and by the way, I'm also secondary, and I think so is Constance, so elementary classrooms are also going to be a bit of their own beast as well. But if you're willing to go somewhere like places like a higher turnover, like in Kuwait, for instance, or in places just that happen to, I think a lot of the Middle Eastern schools struggle, I'll be honest, to attract single female teachers. Like my husband and I were applying and we would get emails that would say like, would you and your wife like to come here? And I was like, can you email me too? Because I'm one of the applicants. So it just depends on where you're going. And so you'd have to look at the particular place.
One thing I'll add on CERT, and so Melissa wrote about reciprocity in the chat. It's even if you've met all the qualifications, even if you're in a state with reciprocity, there's a bureaucracy, which I didn't experience bureaucracy at Yale, and I didn't really experience bureaucracy when I worked in finance. Last year, I qualified for my professional license. I had graduated from my initial license. It took a year. I filled out the paperwork. I waited 3 months. It got rejected. They didn't tell me why. I had to put in the paperwork again. And so it's not necessarily just the tests you take and the degrees you have, but also needing to navigate those systems and just being prepared to ask lots of questions and follow up when paperwork doesn't come through. Because education systems are often disorganized and very underfunded. And so it's important to self-advocate as a professional in that world.
I also want to note that in a US context, some schools don't require certifications, right? Like I know some charter schools don't require you to have a teacher certification, or some private schools also don't require you, right? And so I just want to highlight that piece that that some schools don't require, whether that's good or bad, that's up for debate, right? But That is the fact.
Yeah, that while other people are thinking of questions, that kind of connects to something I was curious about, which is like, I think a lot of people are unsure whether they'd like to teach in like a private school, even like outside the international context, whether they'd like to teach in like a private school in the US or a public school, and like, you know, area, like all that kind of things, like age range, like how do you make those kinds of determinations about like more specifics in teaching once you know that you're interested in teaching?
That's really, it's really tough. I think it involves a lot of research and connecting with people and hearing their stories and their experiences. That's what took me to urban education. I was thinking, you know, maybe I could do a private school. At this time, some people were saying that private schools, like you could get paid more at some like boarding school. I'm not really sure. Someone was like, yeah, you could have a better experience in the classroom at private schools, and you have more support and et cetera. But once I started talking to some teachers who were teaching in urban education, I was like, this seems like more it's my vibe, you know, like the challenge of being in urban ed. There are challenges in education, period. But some of the things that they were telling me about the support that students in the schools in Connecticut were facing and weren't getting the support for, and how I could help meet those needs, and the challenge of race within these schools as well. Like a lot of them, they didn't have teachers who looked like me. Those were the sorts of conversations that I had that helped me to make the decision to know that urban education was for me. So I think like really try to reach out to people who have worked in education and hear their stories and see what resonates with you personally. Like, how do you feel? And try to get into classrooms. Like Alyssa, I think it's great that you opened up your class, like get into classrooms if you can. See if you can get into schools and see what feels right. I know this may sound like woo-woo, but like really, what feels right for you? Because you'll know, your body will feel, your body knows what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And so as much as you can, like get into different school settings, talk to people and get those experiences to figure out what will jive with you personally.
I want to agree completely with what Constance is talking about, because what keeps you going as a teacher is, for me at the least, is the ability to do the job well. And the part of the job that matters most to you is not always equally doable in different settings. One thing that I will talk about is I'm really, really passionate about writing education as in a social studies classroom, because that's typically, you know, a lot of people, oh yeah, English teacher will teach that, but I really believe everybody has to teach the students how to write. And when I did my teacher training program, was placed as an intern in a public district here. The 8th grade teacher that I was working with had 180 students go through his classroom every day, based on, I think it was 6 sections of about 30-ish. I'm not the math teacher, don't make me do the multiplication. But it's not possible for me to do the job in a way that feels satisfying to me in a school of that size. So I know I need to be in a smaller classroom setting. I also enjoy working with high needs writers, and that's what drew me to ESL. And that's what drew me to my current position, where I work with a lot of students with learning difficulties. If your desire or your passion is to do good civics outreach, for instance, to help get kids ready for voting, you may be like, I got to get into a rural district and I want to teach what this matters to me, and I want to have the maximum number of kids come through my classroom, or I want the maximum number of kids to be exposed to someone of my background and someone who connects to their background. So a lot of these things are going to be different. And if you end up in a situation where what matters to you can't be done well, I think it's one of the things that breaks people out of the profession. The other piece of that, I would say, is that there's a huge difference, especially in secondary, with being in a large department versus being teaching. Like when you get into a small enough school, which is where I like to be, you are the social studies department. And, you know, this is the department meeting is, I'd like to change the curriculum to have more emphasis on injustices towards Native Americans. What do you think? Well, I'm the rest of the department and I say yes to me. All right, we all vote yes, we're going to do it. And that's really different from working in a large department. Now, other people really want a large department because there's a collaboration and people have resources they can share to you, and field trips, especially as a first-year teacher, somebody can give you all of that support and guidance. So as you move forward, what makes teaching work for you and what satisfies you, if it's not happening, think about your context and don't give up on the teaching piece of it. Think about, maybe I need to be somewhere else and then I could do it in a way that makes it work.
100% agree. Something else that I want to highlight is that wherever you decide to teach, especially some beginning teacher, you make sure that you teach somewhere where you feel supported, okay? Because that's so key, to feel supported by administrators, by your colleagues, especially as a beginning teacher. And so in addition to doing that sort of self-awareness exploration, like you need to find a school environment that's supportive, right? Because if you don't feel supported, then you're going to leave the profession and say, this is a terrible profession, right? But if you find a place that's supportive, and be like, this is really hard because it's a hard profession, but it's also, you're going to feel that support and love. So I just wanted to highlight that piece.
Thank you so much. Oh, Constance, go ahead.
Can I just say one last thing about this? Right now, I'm not sure how many of you are seniors, but if you are thinking about going into education for next year, just flexibility is the name of the game right now, considering our current context. I'm teaching online. I know in the US it's very different, like in different places, but you know, COVID is not showing signs of going away. So like you may be in person, you may have like a week online, you know, like there's so much flexibility that's needed in education right now. And what I'm seeing, I'm not sure if what I'm seeing on television is correct about, you know, the safety in schools with masks and vaccines, and, you know, just right now is a time in education that requires a lot of flexibility with teaching. So you do want to be in a place that's very supportive, where you feel supported by your network and by your principal. Someone said, interview your principal. This is, talk to the people and see if you feel like this, it's right for you, because you'll need a support system more now than ever before, probably, in education.
So there's a question in the chat from Robin for Israel about the Dream Teacher Project. That would be really cool if you could share a little bit about that, actually.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. I know there's time constraints. So it's an organization my sister and I founded this year to support and retain more first-year BIPOC educators in the US. So we're currently working with 5 first-year teachers of color across the country, and we're providing them with teacher development and also financial literacy. So the organization believes that it's possible to build generational wealth with a teacher salary. It just takes financial literacy and more intentionality from the part of the teacher. And so the basis of the organization is retaining more teachers of color, but also helping them be the catalyst to build generational wealth within their communities of color.
Amazing, thank you. I'll find the link to that also and just put it in the chat to the website. And then I think, Professor Debs asked about if you could all talk about what the salary is like for a starting teacher in each of your contexts. More of a practical question, but I think people are probably curious.
It's a great question.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I would say you can always Google. You're going to get pretty accurate data. New York City is something like $55,000 for a brand new teacher with no master's degree these days. It is very, very hard to live in New York City on $55,000 pre-tax. So don't just look at the salary, look at the cost of living, but that's New York.
So for international schools, that they tend to have a pay scale. Sometimes that'll even be published on their website, and that's related to your years of experience, and that's related to your qualifications. So it'd be usually a combination of 3 years plus the master's is X or Y. The difference, I think, with international schools is there's an enormous range of perks they can throw at you as secondary benefits. So one year I had been working as a consultant in Washington before I moved. And when I added up the fact that my teacher salary in Korea was untaxed, and that's not true in all countries. In some countries, it is taxed. That's especially like European countries. But that's different. In European countries, you get national health care. In Korea, you don't, right? So that's part of why you pay in, what you get from paying in. So I was either untaxed or taxed at something like $1,000 a year. It was negligible. Then they threw in housing. So you think about the fact that if from 36,000, I think is what I made that first year, you were not paying, you were free housing, which was probably a solid $12,000, right? So that's the equivalent of $48,000 a year. Then they were paying for your healthcare premiums. So that goes up to maybe, 52,000 something. This was a long time ago. So it was pre-ACA. So things have gone differently. The professional development budget was really robust. So I was able to get classwork and things that would cost sometimes $2,500 or $4,000. I got to take students on field trips to like Tokyo Disney, and that was part of what I did, right? I got trips back and forth to the US every year that was included in my salary. Another piece of that becomes, it depends on what you want to spend your money on. One of the things I wanted to do was travel, right? So if I'm leaving from Japan, suddenly Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Thailand, these are local flights. This is like going from Chicago to Florida in terms of distance. So you can go, these, instead of being a once in a lifetime trip, these become a $400 airfare, which is suddenly a big difference. So when you're thinking about how much you make, you need to factor in cost of living, but you also, if you're doing international, and all of this is in that document that I shared, you need to ask yourself, the other piece is currency. What currency are you paid in? So if you are being paid in countries like Europe or places like Europe or Japan, the Eurozone, you're typically paid in the local currency. You may be paid, when I was in Korea, it was a split of Korean won and US dollars. You have to look at the exchange rate if you're considering wiring money home to pay off student loans. So there are other complicated financial factors for that. Oh, and of course I didn't need a car. So when you don't need a car and you're not paying for a car and you're not paying for like all of that, I mean, a car and car insurance is thousands of dollars a year on your car payments. So all of that stuff would change your financial picture. Within the US, a lot of people who are trying to find jobs in tight markets will spend a year or two in these southern schools that don't pay as well to gather those 2 to 3 years of experience. And then they reapply somewhere like Pennsylvania, where you get paid at a much higher salary scale. And they're competitive for that position now when they weren't before. So throw those information out there as well. North Carolina, I think, is not paying well these days.
Another thing that I want to add here is to also look at the teacher benefits. So the benefits, at least in the US context, also vary depending on where you teach, depending on where you teach a charter school, private school, public school, also city, state, and it can make a huge difference. Like, for example, the charter school where I work now, I don't pay for healthcare, whereas in Nashville, I was paying a lot of money for healthcare. And so that makes a huge difference. I also got way more money in DC, even though the cost of living is higher here. I got way more money in DC than I did in Nashville, significantly more. And so make sure to also do research in terms of the teachers' pay and also the benefits in these specific locations and schools that you're looking at.
Thank you all. We probably have time for one more question if anyone has a question. I don't know if there's anything left. Maybe I can ask one of my other residual questions if we have time. Do you think that's okay, Professor Debs? We have a second? Okay, let me decide. I'm trying to think what would be. Oh, I think this is something that I actually learned a little bit about this in Professor Shivi's class, but I think like other people would benefit from hearing about it. What do you think? I mean, someone mentioned like when you're interviewing for a school position, you also sort of want to interview the interviewer to figure out like things about the school, that might be important to you in deciding whether you want to work there. So does anyone want to share like some things you should ask about or things you should be looking for when you are kind of interviewing a school back as they're interviewing you? And like, I know there was also a question, like, what does support look like in an educational context? I think there was like a little bit of discussion about that in the chat, but just expanding on either of those questions would be great.
I can go. I think thinking about your individual context and thinking about your needs is super important. Always, I know going into an interview, sometimes it's like, I want them to want me, I want to get this job, but also think about like, is this a place for you? And like me, I have kidney disease. I have lupus and kidney disease. And so I've had 2 kidney transplants, and my first was right after I graduated from Yale. So I need like ongoing support. I have a chronic condition, so I need ongoing support. So like things that I would think of when I go in, what is your policy on sick leave? Those sorts of healthcare. Those are like top priority for me. So you have to think about your situation if you have children, or sorry, you all, I have to remember my audience, but if you like take care of younger siblings, for instance, or if you have like a parent who you might need to go home for every couple of months, or whatever your situation is, thinking about how asking them like, how can I be supported in this area? One thing that is super important, especially as a first-year teacher, is feeling comfortable going to either your superiors when you're having difficulty. So if you feel comfortable asking, the principal questions and they're responsive about what your needs are, that's a pretty good sign, because you are going to need support in your first years of teaching, your first years, not just your first year. And when you're interviewing, if that person is receptive to responding to the questions about your needs, that might be a good sign that might be a place that you can feel comfortable in. Asking about what their philosophy is in teaching is important. Not just responding to questions about, what makes you a great teacher, what makes this a great school, what makes you a great principal. Not in a way that's, confrontational, but these are really important conversations to see if it is a good mesh for you. So think about your needs and put those first. I know it may sound like, oh, I don't want to be off-putting, but you will find that your needs have to be met for you to have a successful experience in a school. And so many people leave this incredible profession and these incredible young people because their needs are not being met. So put those first.
I think I agree so much. The administrator shapes a lot of your experience. One thing that I think you can look for when you talk to the administrator is, who do you feel like you're being? Are you like, I have to sit like this and talk like this? And I was, if you're laughing in that interview, if you're having a good, if they find the same things funny and positive that you do, and they are going to be leading a lot of faculty meetings that you're going to be sitting through. And if you are suffering in that interview, guess what's ahead of you, right? A lot of these unpleasant sessions. The other thing I would say is that, if they don't know how to talk to a candidate in an engaging way, that's what teaching is. It's talking to people in an engaging way and supporting them and making listening a rewarding and active experience. So that makes me have questions about, what's going on in the school community. I think you can also get a really good perspective. I mentioned this in the chat a couple of times by talking around who's leaving the position. Can you find them? Can you ask? It's really common in international schools to say, can I be put in touch with the teacher who's leaving? That's not as common in the US, but they're probably findable, right? They have like a contact information, or you may know somebody else in those circles. but the etiquette in international schools is perfectly normal to say, can I talk to the teacher who's leaving this position? Half the time they're like, yeah, I was just ready for another country. Or half the time they're saying, you know, oh yeah, my mom got sick and I'm moving home. Nothing to do with the school. It was great. That's what I was happy to tell people when I was leaving. I love the school. I'd stay in Fukuoka forever, but my father is unwell and I'm going back to the US to be closer to him. And that's a cultural thing. I know it's not always normal in all schools, but you also will talk to somebody and they'll be like, I'm leaving because I hate this principal. Or even I'm leaving because there's something going on in the business office and my paycheck was always 3 weeks late and this and that. Like, there's all kinds of things that could be going on. So the networks of schools are also a little smaller than you think. You're probably not more than a couple. I will bet you anything that Constance and I could find somebody that we both knew in international schools within 1 or 2 degrees. Like she knows somebody that knows somebody I know, or we both know the same person. So if you can find those networks, sometimes even parents can be a good resource for what's going on in the district or the school. And they'll say something like, they would be a good tip off for things like, I know they say they've moved away from X type of discipline, but that's happening here and we don't like it. So they will be somebody who's a third party who can give you a little bit of that audit as well. Can I throw one separate thing in that I didn't mention? None of us has talked, I think, about foreign language certification. And Alyssa talked about how STEM is an area of need and that's an easier position to find. Especially where I am, Spanish positions, Chinese language positions, they go unfilled for a long time. I know my school had a lot of trouble even hiring for French. So as you think about certifications, you can think about, and I don't know how all states work, but you can think about that primary one that maybe relates to your major. But in Pennsylvania, if you are certified in anything, all you do for a second certification is take an exam. And if you can add on, then you're legally treated the same as someone whose primary certification is French. Social studies with a French with a social studies add-on and social studies with a French add-on are equivalent. So you may find yourself able to find a position, look at what's in demand and what's short in the places where you're interested in applying. That's one of the things about my ESL certification. It's a shortage in the area where I was working at the time. So if you have a skill like that, even if it's not the core teaching position that you think you're interested in, it may give you opportunities to at least get into a system. And it's often easier to move around within a school, especially in private schools, than it is to apply from scratch.
Thank you all so much. It's been like really amazing to hear from you. And I think especially just the fact that there is such a diversity of experiences, I think is really helpful for people, but also just like hearing these common threads of like looking out for yourself and like, you know, really doing your due diligence, like using your networks. Like, I think this is really helpful information because I think sometimes it can feel like you're in the minority at Yale, as has been mentioned a lot of times, if you're interested in going into education. But yeah, this has been really uplifting for me. And I think for everybody else to kind of see that this network exists and wants to engage with us. So thank you all for that.